Okay, good morning, everybody, and happy International Women in Engineering Day. This is quite a special day for all of us in an engineering firm, obviously, but I think it's also a special day generally because it's one where we celebrate and remember the impact that women have in the engineering field, but also the impact that the engineering field can have on women everywhere. The theme of International Women in Engineering Day for 2022 is inventors and innovators. And what we really can think of when we have a theme like this is cool technological things and things that aren't usual and are really cutting edge, etc. But we forget that sometimes you really have to reinvent our own cities and the way that they are, and we have to innovate in the very practical daily things that we do in our lives. So this is why today we have decided to go for a theme that is inclusivity in design and to effectively discuss what does that mean in practice. So we have 4 fantastic speakers today. So I think we're going to leave the floor to them. They're going to say much more interesting things than I am. But before we do, I'm just going to very quickly introduce myself, the co-chair, and the event as well. So this is an online, it's a hybrid event. So we have some people here in the audience, but also we have quite a few people online. And it's going to be in the form of a few presentations. So 1 presentation from each of our speakers, 4 in total, and then a bit of a panel discussion here. So just a little bit about myself before we start. So my name is Laura Tabitz, and I'm a civil engineer by background. And I've been at Arup for 11 years, almost. And I am the chair of the Connect Women London Committee. I actually joined Connect Women as soon as I joined Arup, and I've been with Connect Women ever since. Connect Women is actually a grassroots staff-led network in Arup. So it's an internal network that effectively looks at means and ways to connect women to each other, to give them a bit more visibility and to effectively have them achieve their full potential in a world that at the moment still doesn't allow them to do that as fairly as we would like. So we do host quite a few events during the year, and one of the yearly events that we do host is International Women in Engineering Day. So hopefully this is going to be a great event with all of you present here. And today I have the pleasure of co-chairing this event with my colleague May. May, do you want to quickly introduce yourself to everyone?
So hello everyone online and in the room. My name is May. I lead the Access and Inclusive Environments team in Arup, so specialising in inclusive design. Happy International Women in Engineering Day. Yeah, thank you very much.
Excellent. So please keep notes during the event. Please keep notes of your questions. Online, you can start typing your questions in the chat. Everybody will be able to see your questions online when they get accepted. And May has her laptop. She's not doing any work. She's actually looking at these questions. I also have my phone. This is exactly what I'm doing too. So we are not ignoring you. This is just the way hybrid events work. But without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker who is here in the room, Marina Milosev. Marina is an urban planner and a landscape architect with over 10 years of experience across a range of specialist areas, including the preparation of strategic planning policies. So Marina, you currently work as a Principal Planning Policy Officer in London Legacy Development Corporation, and you're going to tell us a little bit more about that and your work there today. So please, let's all welcome Marina to the stage.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks a lot for a brilliant introduction that kind of like really saved some of my time. And what I really wanted to really refer, and thanks a lot for saying this, is that what I'm going to be talking about today is a project that at London Legacy Development Corporation we recently, well, last year conducted, which is looking at the safety of women and girls and gender minorities in public realm. And I absolutely agree that often we need to take a step back, apply very simple methodology, very simple tools to reinvent and try to fix something when we know that it's not working. So it's definitely not cutting edge technology, but I think its beauty in it is because anyone can easily adopt the same way that we're doing so and do something about it. So just a very brief one for those who might not be aware. London Legacy Development Corporation is one of two mayoral development corporations in London, and we are set to deliver regeneration of the Olympic area in East London. So we don't have the full remits as a standard council would have. So we actually are just a local planning authority regeneration body. We also own the land, so we're a landowner with development control powers, and we also manage the park, Olympic Park, and the venues within. And this is quite important because when we're talking about the topic of inclusivity and particularly gender inclusivity, like this topic spans across way too many different organizations. So this was kind of like one of the things that limit us in what we can do, but I will come to that later. So just bear in mind that we do have quite limited remits when it comes to our yeah, I'm a landscape architect and an urban designer, and when I started working on this project was probably the first time in 10 years of my career that someone asked me to kind of like look back and reassess the gender inclusivity within public realm. And you kind of like get almost like an ignorant as a professional, and you think like, well, we are doing already a lot. We have policies, we do have good practice. So one of the first things I was like, so why we're failing? Like, what are we not implementing our policies? So one of the things that I wanted to do when I started the project is to actually look, what is it we're already doing? And I obviously looked in terms of planning, in terms of LLDC. And I thought like we're quite good resourced planning authorities. So there are quite a lot of sort of policy documents. We have excellent inclusive design standards. And we actually are quite lucky enough to also have a panel of independent experts who are looking particularly about how inclusive developments are within our area. And those are like a brilliant people. We also do have policies that support mix of uses and activation of active frontages. We have obviously like everyone's statement of community involvement. We obviously are a little bit ambitious when it comes to implementing that. So then the question really was like, but why when it comes to kind of like safety and perception of safety of women and girls, and again, other gender minorities, this is still an issue. And we know that obviously in an inadequately designed urban environment affect everyone, but what we learn is that it does affect more, like disproportionately affect women. And we have some of the data that I'm just going to mention one that really kind of like always resonates with me is that recent UN survey has shown that 71% of women in the UK have experienced sexual harassment in public spaces, and this is way kind of like a higher when actually look at the younger age groups. And because of this, we know that women and girls tend to adopt avoidance strategy, avoiding their area, walking at certain day of night or entirely avoiding area. And this one really can preclude them from accessing to job opportunities, education, social or civic activities, leisure activities. And in my view, this is really inequality. This is like a definition of inequality. So, and because of this and unfortunately kind of like a recent urging issue and the media coverage of a couple of tragic events in London that we had, is that many organizations, including LLDC, has set up a specific board, which I'm part of, to, as I said, kind of like a look at the review of the approach of gender equality in public spaces. And this is when I said, like, you know, using very simple tools and methodologies, it can't really work wonders. So what we actually did is that we said, well, let's just understand that like, we don't know anything. Like we are professional, we have experience, but perhaps maybe we don't know. So what we did is that we went to consult. So we went to actually ask people who are using that space, particularly when it comes to perception of safety. Like I can't assume what someone can feel. And also there is an element of intersectionality. So I'm a white woman of certain age. And even if I try to put myself in someone's shoes, I really can't, because I can only experience what I experience as a white woman of certain age and certain education. So we partnered with Commonplace, very simple map. We basically just went out there, promoted and said, please, can you tell us where you feel safe, where you feel unsafe, what is that makes you feel safe or unsafe. The great thing about that is that Commonplace is running this project for a little while. So actually they partnered with a UN Woman and they have a very structured questionnaire. So actually it was pretty easy. We had a structured questionnaire and we're just like asking. And one of the beautiful things is that we usually, when we do this type of consultation, we usually get like 20 to 30 responses. We had 500, which really means that people care. We're a small area and people really, really care. And we get really invaluable insight into this. And you can say the map, like red is where people feel unsafe, green where they feel safe. One thing that I just want to mention, because if someone wants to run something similar, is that hard to reach groups are hard to reach, but when it comes to this, it's really hard. So you really need to be very clever about how you do it, because it's very important, as I said, to take into consideration intersectionality. Otherwise, all of this, it kind of like doesn't really have so much merit. And then we actually commissioned Arup to, it's a Maze team, and this was absolutely brilliant piece of work. So once we had the data, they looked into data, they analyzed, and they came with the recommendations, which is what we also wanted. So we not only wanted to know what's the problem, but we wanted to know what can we do about it. So this is actually now available online on our website. And if anyone is really interested in running similar consultation or something, I definitely, or just like learning a little bit more about the topic, I definitely recommend looking at the report. It's absolutely super comprehensive and brilliant. And it looks into intersectionality, and it's like really, really comprehensive and granular. What did we learn? I'm not going to really go into too much of this. Nothing really that, you know, would be not expected. So obviously light came as a one of the most important kind of like a thing in terms of what makes people feel safe or like less safe within the area. Well, actually women and girls. But we also wanted to be a little bit more ambitious and actually look into some of the other things that perhaps like really go fall beyond the remits of our organization. So behavior, crime, etc. Because we are working with the stakeholders in also addressing these issues. So we're collecting that data. And then, I mean, again, not going to really go into this, but we really learned a lot from Arup advising us on this. So in terms of lighting, is like, I just want to say more lights is not always a solution. So you need to like go back and learn again everything that you thought you might know. And this is really just to show that, again, we're not just identifying the issues, we were actually looking at the recommendations, and we wanted to be very area specific in terms of our area. So we wanted to identify a very kind of like a hotspot and then see what the issue and then the recommendation. So now that we learn all this, we have this brilliant report. What is actually that we are doing? What can we do? And it's actually all really practical. And it took me maybe a couple of days for some of the things where I kind of like work, my area of work to set this up. So we have a group of stakeholders, which is very important because, again, all of these issues are way beyond just our remit. So we have a Met Police, we have all of the other landowners on the board, we have boroughs, social services, education, and we really work together, like everyone bought into the recommendations. We are using the report as evidence-based, so any intervention in space, any of our projects or third-party projects, we want them to look at the evidence that we have prepared and see and tell us how they're going to respond to that. We're going to do lighting and visibility audits across the park. And then we have a planning decision committee, quality review panel, and we have a neighborhood review panel. So all of the really great experts who are on board, but what we want to do is work with them to kind of like then sort of like teach them or tell them to pay attention to certain things. And then when they're assessing and scrutinizing third-party proposals, that they can also take that into consideration. And we are collecting money as a planning authority, so we thought, and part of that money goes to community, so we thought let's be a little bit more proactive and maybe finance some community projects that are going to tackle this issue. And we actually have a great project, Badu Sports, which is a sport field designed for girls and with girls that we are financing. And we are going to actually now look to produce gender equality in public realm design guidance, because as I often say, it's not that developers don't want to do anything about this topic, is that they don't know what to do. So our next step is really to come with some recommendations where we can just hand to developers and they can, they can adopt, or we can build on that together. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marina. It's great to see, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but it's great to see local authorities effectively not just knowing that there's an issue, but really digging deep into where and why, and then what do we do about this. It's quite interesting that I just before the elections, obviously, they were going around, knocking on other people's doors. Where are you going to vote? Etc. And they asked me, is there anything? I live in Brixton. Is there anything in Brixton that you don't is a bit of an issue? And I said, well, actually, there's this little stretch that I have to walk through that feels really unsafe. And I don't know what it is, whether it's lighting or what it is, but maybe just look at it. And I got an email back saying, we had looked at it last year and it complies with all of the lighting standards. And I was like, I'm sure it does. That wasn't my question, though. Anyway, so yeah, really good to see that, somewhere we are digging deeper to understand things. Okay, on to our second speaker now, also in the room, Kaylee from Arup. So Kaylee is an archaeologist with over 10 years of experience in art and heritage across different organizations across the world. You moved to London in 2017, and your master's at UCL was a research on decolonization and community engagement with contested heritage sites. And this is what Kaylee is going to talk to us about today. So welcome, Kaylee.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Laura, for the introduction. As she mentioned, my name is Kaylee, and I'm an archaeologist with the Historic Environment team here at Arup within Climate and Sustainability Services. And I'm here to give you a super whistle-stop tour of some research that I did with UCL, which examined ways in which decolonization theory can be translated and integrated into the daily operations of heritage professionals, thereby making the management of heritage more equitable and representative of all stakeholders. So to start off, a very brief definition of decolonization. It's a term that is a theoretical but also an increasingly practical framework that focuses on identifying and dismantling the intrinsic influences of colonialism and Eurocentrism in all aspects of society. And a key part of this is the recognition that colonial structures divided society into two main groups, a strict hierarchy between those in power and those what some scholars have called the subaltern, which refers to the most marginalized groups in society, whether that be along gender or racial lines, and whose voices and experiences have been largely silenced. Thus, the aim of decolonization is ultimately to subvert this dynamic so that marginalized groups are recognized more greatly at global and local levels. Now, decolonization is something that's been applied to a number of disciplines over the past few decades. And you might have noticed pieces in the news about decolonizing curriculum, for example. But in a heritage context, decolonization is really relevant through two central points. The first being that the traditional definition of what constitutes heritage inherently was initially constructed within very Eurocentric definitions. And this is reflected in the adoption of early heritage management charters, such as the Venice Charter in 1964, which prioritized the in situ preservation of monumental sites, standing buildings, and archaeological evidence over any other sort of definition of heritage. So essentially, these early methods viewed heritage sites as static, a snapshot in time, usually in ancient history, completely divorced from any sort of living community and any ways that they might view or engage with their heritage. In recent decades, however, the field has begun to expand to include multiple definitions of what is heritage, intangible aspects such as language, art, foodways. And we also are now recognizing that different communities may interact with heritage sites in ways that perhaps may not prioritize original fabric, for instance, and also that these relationships evolve and change over time. The second main part of decolonization movement within a heritage context is also the platforming of other stakeholders alongside heritage professionals. So basically what we want to avoid are situations where experts are educating local populations about their own heritage, but rather including them in a cohesive manner to work together to manage heritage in a sensitive and effective way. So this is all well and good, but it's pretty highbrow, it's quite theoretical. So my research wanted to find methods that could be implemented in the day-to-day work of heritage professionals so that we could ensure that that inclusivity was at the forefront of our work. And to do this, I picked out 4 main, what I call key practices. And the first, and perhaps this is a bit obvious, but arguably the most important practice when managing heritage in a decolonized way, is to ethically identify and engage with local stakeholders. And this has a particular focus on what we call descendant communities, which I actually don't think is a great term because it makes it sound more specific than it is. But it is a bit of a catch-all term referring to any group that has a genealogical, historical, ethnic, cultural, religious, or basically any other connection to a site. And the key focus really when interfacing with descendant communities is to gain as in-depth and a nuanced understanding as possible of what they consider significant, why it's valued that way, and the ways in which that they engage with aspects of their heritage. And this could be with a discrete site, or it could also be more intangible aspects of heritage that I mentioned before. And this information that we get from consultation should then, of course, inform and be reflected in any management practices moving forward, even if it is divergent from any focuses that heritage professionals may have initially outlined. And something also extremely important to note here off the bat is that communities and groups of stakeholders, they're not monolithic. They may have differing views and different relationships with their own with their shared heritage. And so it's important to include as many intersections within a stakeholder group as possible when we're doing these sorts of consultations. The next thing that I highlighted is what I've called multivocality. And this is a concept that can manifest in a few different ways, depending on what type of heritage work you're doing. But essentially the idea is that we want to consider whose stories are being told and who's telling those stories. And basically you want a plurality of narratives and experiences to be included and represented in our work. And in the case of my case study research, which unfortunately I don't really have time to get into here, but I focused on site interpretation at plantation sites. And so storyboards, guided tours, that sort of thing. And that's a very concrete example of how multivocality can be incorporated. But it can broadly refer to any way that engagement with descendant communities is translated into heritage management, whether it be through interpretation, management or conservation plans, consultation on proposed developments, etc. So already you can see from this that these key practices very much flow together and feed into one another. Which brings me to my next slide, which is about the inclusion of diverse audiences, which means that visitors or stakeholders from across racial, ethnic, economic, and other boundaries should feel included and represented. And this is actually an aspect that my case study participants found the most difficult to reckon with, because it's not really something within our direct control as heritage professionals. So I've kind of described it as a practice that is almost nurtured by the implementation of other practices. And that's not to say that it shouldn't be a focus or it shouldn't be a targeted goal of an organization, but it'll often require other things to achieve it. And the final takeaway from my research showed that using a partnership or landscape level model of managing heritage is a really effective way to implement the practices that I've already discussed, because it's a way that we can, like, quite literally subvert the traditional top-down management style, and while also providing a space for a multitude of different organizations and individuals to be involved. Now, I've identified practices, it's all easy now, right? Of course not. So there's myriad challenges when actually trying to put this into practice, which can really be summed up as aspiration versus implementation. And the balance of knowing that this is sort of the right thing to do and the right way to conduct ourselves at work, but also just the logistics of the day-to-day things that we need to get done. And a lot of that comes from capacity building, because naturally this type of foundation takes time and it takes resources, which need to be built into the budget for an organization or a project. And many individual heritage organizations, they're already underfunded, they already struggle to find adequate staffing. And within a development-led context, like the work we do at Arup, this needs to be added into a bid figure when you're talking with a client, and it may not be something that they really understand the value of. And something else that is frequently cited as a challenge is community reluctance. And this is particularly salient in areas that have been very strongly negatively affected by colonialism or sites of negative heritage, like the plantation sites that were my case study examples. And heritage professionals often find that local stakeholders may be reluctant or not willing to engage. And this is difficult to navigate, but at the end of the day, the aim is to work with local populations rather than against them and sort of meeting them where they're at. So rather than focusing on a prescribed number of bodies to the door, for instance, the focus should be that we are meeting them where they are, as I said, and making sure that the representation that we are reflecting in our work is representative of the wishes of the wider population. But the great thing about this is there are many opportunities. So a recurring theme throughout this presentation is perhaps the most important philosophy of decolonized heritage management is that we want to interact with the present as much as the past. And this requires the sensitive inclusion of living descendant communities. And while it may take a bit of reframing of our mindset as heritage professionals, approaching management from this angle provides us with a wealth of knowledge and experiences to draw from, and really gives us an opportunity to engage with a full spectrum of history. And just to conclude, overall, translating decolonization theory into tangible parts of our daily work. It's complex, it's ambitious, it's nonlinear, and it's going to be an ongoing process. It requires the consistent reconfiguration of some pretty fundamental principles in our field, which again will continue to evolve over time. However, by identifying these ways that we can incorporate practices into our work, even on a small scale, we are taking steps to ensuring that the heritage field is more equitable and inclusive to everyone.
Thank you very much, Kaylee. Already we can identify a couple of themes here. In particular, engage with people who it's difficult to engage with and find a way to actually reach out, to actually include them rather than come top down and say, we know what we're doing and this is what's written in the standards. As next speaker, we're going to move to our two online speakers now. So in the first instance, Rachel Cahill. Rachel is head of Chief Executive Office within Transport Infrastructure Ireland. And Rachel leads key strategic cross-organizational initiatives and programs, most notably being the TII's Sustainability and Climate Action Strategy. Rachel commissioned this report that you can see on the screen already, Traveling in a Woman's Shoes, and is going to take us through some of the works of this report and the results and outcomes of this report. So, I mean, as being a leading transport agency within Ireland's transport community, TII recognizes the importance of understanding and addressing the different mobility patterns and needs of both men and women. And this is part of the reason why this report specifically wanted to look at this half of the population that is often overlooked. So, Rachel, I don't know if you have control of the slides or if you want to share your own.
Good morning, everybody. I have taken control of the slides, so I'll share my own, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for that introduction, Laura. As you say, my name is Rachel Cahill and I work with Transport Infrastructure Ireland, or TII. We are a public sector transport agency under the Irish Government's Department of Transport. And TII's mission is to provide sustainable transport infrastructure and services, delivering a better quality of life, supporting economic growth and respecting the environment. And our vision is to ensure that this infrastructure is safe, inclusive and resilient, delivering better accessibility and sustainability for all. So I'm delighted to be joining you here this morning from Ireland to share with you some of the really interesting research we carried out in 2020 with your Arab colleagues in Dublin and also London. And this is in regard to looking at the travel behaviour of women in Ireland, and which is part of the global movement of getting people out of their cars and onto more sustainable modes of transport. So our Travelling in a Woman's Shoes study provides insight and data into what motivates women in Ireland to choose their primary mode of transport. As we all know, women make up 50% of the population. However, their transport needs, which are different to men's, are not really understood and currently do not enter the equation when it comes to transport policy, planning and design. So we're here today to talk about inclusive design, and my view is that until the specific needs of the population are better, half the population are better understood, we will really struggle to achieve this. So one key message before I start to share the findings of the study is that it's not really about improving transport solutions for women. It's about improving transport solutions for all and for delivering transport, sustainable transport for men, women and children. So just to get started then, the climate crisis has created an urgent need for a fundamental change in how we live and get around. And the UN Sustainable Development Goals capture the challenges for mobility most prominently in goals 11 and 13. Transitioning Ireland to sustainable transport modes is challenging because of our historical car dependency. In Ireland, 75% of all trips are taken by car, which is extremely high in comparison to other countries. So while the climate crisis is urgent, our study found that people in Ireland see it as an abstract issue and don't yet associate it with a strong impetus to change daily travel behaviour. So transitioning Ireland to sustainable travel modes will require extensive new infrastructure provisions and efforts to change travel behaviours. With regard to travel behaviour, it is now well established that transport is not gender neutral, that men and women have different mobility realities, that women have more complex travel needs due to trip chaining and caregiving duties. Women's concern for personal safety during travel is heightened. We know that gaps in data make it difficult to pinpoint specific issues that need to be addressed, and the traditionally male-dominated leadership of transport planning and projects has driven disproportionate outcomes for both women and men when interacting with transport systems. So as such, studying and understanding women's travel needs is of critical importance when we talk about designing inclusive, sustainable transport and mobility solutions and influencing people's travel behaviour. And this is principle number 1 of 5 coming from the International Transport Forum. And for me, this is really the launch pad to designing and transitioning to sustainable transport. Before we conducted our own research, we looked at the data available to us from the Irish Central Statistics Office and other sources, and this provided the basic building blocks for our study. So highlights on this slide include that in Ireland, women drive more than men, with 71% of journeys taken by car for women compared to 67% for men. In terms of women's caregiving roles, 45% of women in Ireland provide care to others on a daily basis, compared to 29% for men. And women spend 21 hours a week on average caring, compared to 11 hours for men. We looked at the available international research, and it'll come as no surprise to see that safety is the biggest concern for women when choosing how to travel. And other themes coming from the international research include access, reliability, and convenience and comfort. When we started our own research, we adopted a two-pronged approach to really get under the bonnet and find out what motivates women when choosing their transport modes. We conducted ethnographic research with 21 women, spending 2 hours with each woman and joining them as they went about their daily travels. And this gave us rich and detailed insight into women's travel needs. We also conducted a quantitative survey with 1,000 people, 500 men and 500 women. The main findings from the survey are highlighted on this slide and include women rely heavily on the car, with 81% of women owning or having access to a car. And the same is true for men, with 85% ownership. With regard to public transport, women in Dublin use public transport at the highest rate of 27% for all trips, and this compares to 14% for men. In terms of being dependent on the car, women in Dublin are eager to drive less. 47% of women in Dublin want to drive less compared to 34% of men. And 79% of women consider the car to be a necessity compared to 88% of men. Some additional highlights include women shoulder more caregiving responsibility, which is consistent with global trends. We found that amongst women with children, 84% consider themselves to have the sole or lion's share of responsibility for childcare, compared to 48% for men. And we also found that 30% of women surveyed provide primary care to another adult, either in a professional or personal setting. In terms of journey purpose and comparing men and women with families, men's largest reason for travelling is work. That's 26% versus 20% for women, whereas for women it is to drop off and collect children or other family members, and that's 21% compared to 14% for men. We also found from our survey that safety is an issue for all people, with 1 in 3 public transport users having witnessed or experienced some form of harassment or violence while using public transport. 7% of women in Dublin report having experienced sexual harassment on public transport, while 55% of women stated they would not use public transport at night. And 34% of women stated that feelings of insecurity have prevented them from travelling at all. So taking both the ethnographic research and the survey findings, we looked at the following key questions. What drives women to choose their primary transportation modes? The role of the family is huge. Transportation habits and perceptions are formed at an early age. Women's travel patterns change as they get older, in that when life becomes more complex, women typically become more time poor. Public transport no longer becomes a viable option for complex trip chaining, and is seen as not being child friendly. We looked at how do women experience different mobility options today. Women consider the car to be the most pleasant and least stressful mode of transport. But for those who have to drive on a daily basis, it is a burden and a chore. And women actively seek public transport at the weekends for a break. One of the main issues, or some of the main issues with public transport, include lack of feeling safe, lack of support for caregiving needs, and lack of reliability. We also looked at how socioeconomic and geographic factors have an influence. And for women in rural areas who do not grow up learning how to navigate public transport systems, this can be a challenge when moving to the city for work or college, in particular, with regard to antisocial behaviour and safety in general. We looked at the impact of a negative experience, and I've talked about this in the previous slide, but just to say that one bad experience can have a devastating impact and can fundamentally alter a woman's travel behaviour. Finally, we looked at how social factors can influence significant behavioural change. We found that children take climate change very seriously and that they can influence their parents and other adults to think differently. Again, and we see this as an opportunity with regard to helping adults join the dots on climate crisis and how individual travel behaviour impacts the climate. So how can the travel community come together and respond to the travel needs of women? In our report, we tell the stories of 5 women in the Travelling in a Woman's Shoes report, which gives different perspectives, allowing for rich insight and evidence of women's travel needs. And all the evidence from the study gives us guidance towards policy and inclusive design opportunities. And that's really one of the main purposes of the study. It was really to inform and influence future transport policy and design. So in conclusion then, the summary of findings, women's mobility is hindered by existing household gender dynamics that largely place the burden on women. Women are also adversely impacted by being and feeling unsafe in public, in particular when walking and using public transport. Designing sustainable transport infrastructure becomes synonymous with designing inclusive, safe, and high-quality experiences that consider women and the needs of their families, and involving women users in the co-creation of policy to reduce the chance of unintended consequences. So for us in Transport Infrastructure Ireland, we are now applying many of the findings and recommendations coming from the report to our own projects, programmes and operations. And we're also sharing and applying the learnings beyond TII. Being here today is one example, with stakeholders and others involved in both policy formation and design. So thank you very much for inviting me here today and for sharing our Travelling in a Woman's Shoes study. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rachel. And yeah, I mean, I must say that there a lot of insights that again comes from effectively looking deep, trying to understand trying to understand what the real issues are and how to effectively address them. We are getting some feedback. Okay, for our next speaker, we've talked about travel, we've talked about generally cities, we've talked about heritage, and now we're going to talk a little bit about lighting. It did come up a little bit before, but we now have with us all the way from Australia, staying up late for us today, Hoa Yang, who is a senior lighting designer at Arup, who is currently also doing her PhD. Hoa is trained as an architect, and she specializes in daylight and experiential lighting design in her role at Arup. Her practice brings together a 24-hour lighting design with human-centric strategies to transform experiences for minority groups within the built environment. And her current research, which we're going to hear about today, focuses on the role of technical lighting on nighttime experiences for intersectional people in public spaces. So once again, we've just heard about 55% of women not taking public transport at night. So it looks like nighttime is a key time to consider when it comes to providing inclusive and accessible cities for all. So Hoa, over to you.
Thanks for the intro, Lara. Can you see the slides? Is that all working? Ah, wonderful. Hey everyone, so lovely to be joining in from the other side of the world. I also just wanted to say a huge thank you to Ama, Lara, Katie and our marketing team for pulling together this fantastic event. It takes many hands behind the scenes and countless early morning calls to be able to pull together an event across time zones like this. So thank you all for your efforts. So yeah, my name's Hoa. I'm a lighting designer from the Arup office in Melbourne. Today I'll be sharing a research project that we did with XYX Lab at Monash University, which has allowed us to address gender inclusivity and perceptions of safety in nighttime design with lighting. Have you ever felt unsafe walking alone at night or avoided a path that's really dark? We all experience the world differently. The way we look, our physical abilities, and past experiences all affect the way we move around a city at night. The latest OECD study found that only 67% of the general population feel safe when walking alone. And we've also heard more urgent stats locally in the UK from Marina earlier before. The city works as a system. At night, light is the one factor that allows for all of these layers to work seamlessly together. While light provides us with the ability to see, it also has the power to make a space feel really festive or unfriendly. There are huge social and economic consequences if people don't feel safe enough to move around alone at night. Back in 2016, Monash University and Plan International in Australia ran a study called the Free to Be campaign. Through a mobile app, they asked young women and girls to use their phones to drop safe or unsafe pins on a map of Melbourne. What you see there on the screen is a screenshot of the result, with the green dots being the safe sites and the red dots being the unsafe sites. So the larger the circle, the more pins in that particular spot. The study found that a third of young women and girls identified lighting as the reason for feeling unsafe at night. The same study conducted in 5 other major cities all had similar results. And we've just heard from Marina's study as well that lighting is a huge issue, and similarly with Rachel's. So, we all know that this is not just a one city issue. These statistics all show us that as designers, we're forgetting an entire group of the people that we're designing for. So we formed a research collaboration with XYX Lab at Monash University to figure out how we at Arup could address these negative experiences of safety with practical design decisions and start to listen and really take on board marginalised experiences that are often not heard at the decision-making table. We Collected and analysed one of the largest sample sets of lighting and city experience worldwide over the course of 4 weeks in the Melbourne summer, which for those who haven't experienced it, feels a bit like being stuck in an unrelenting fan-forced oven. To summarise our 3 findings briefly, we found that more lights do not make women and girls feel safer. These findings contradict the current external lighting standards and SEPTED approach. We also found that the quality of light is much more important than quantity, especially things like colour rendering. High colour rendering allows you to be able to distinguish the difference between a bush and a person that's walking towards you. We also found a strong correlation between the perception of safety with multiple light sources and warm coloured lights. This is increasingly an urgent problem as cities are starting to adopt cold coloured LEDs as part of their smart city strategies. What's unique about this collaboration is that we were able to use technology to identify practical solutions that address social inequality in the built environment. Starting with this huge data set of marginalised experiences, we merged Arup's technical expertise and proved that when we just aim for numbers in policy or compliance, we can often forget about the everyday experiences of people. We took all this information and created an interactive experience map of the city, which we've started to overlay other information such as acoustics or foliage. Eventually, we want to include an intersectional approach of lived experiences that encompass diversities beyond gender. Research project, we've developed an evidence-based methodology called the Nighttime Vulnerability Assessment, also known as the MVA, as the first step for implementing gender-sensitive design at night. So this methodology identifies practical design challenges by looking at nighttime vulnerability at 3 levels, social, environmental and technical. So the assessment looks beyond the standards and weaves lived experiences with the technical components of nighttime lighting design and SEPTED practices. Through data capture and analysis, our evidence-based design decisions are then validated in our nighttime co-design workshops that prioritise the people who will actually be using the space once it's built. Using these processes, we've worked with local councils, state governments, developers and public infrastructure authorities to tackle nighttime issues like gender-sensitive design, community safety and nighttime spatial equity in a practical and tangible way. This research has really been a vehicle for us at Arup to completely turn the traditional lighting design process on its head and pioneer new methods of inclusive and experience-based nighttime design that we know will create spaces that are inclusive and enjoyable for everyone. Thanks for listening. I'll leave you with a video of one of the nighttime co-design workshops that we ran a few years ago for Melbourne Knowledge Week. If you look closely, you might be able to spot me in a bowl cut in some of the scenes. Thank you.
Person tonight is to try and upskill your lighting vocabulary. We're going to do lighting design together. Use your filters, try and wash up, try and understand what that light is teaching you. We're going to go and do some actual lighting design now. This is the type of city that we want to create. Something that's vibrant, something that's inclusive, and something that's just fun to be around, but really importantly, something that's safe.
Thank you very much, Joel. That was fun. That's a fun lighting design, and you say engineers are boring. Right. Okay. So we have a few minutes now to take some questions. But before we take some questions from the audience, I just wanted to ask our panel here and of course online.
How has the awareness and desire to consider inclusivity in design changed in the last few years, in your opinion? Maybe we can start with our client representation first, Marina and then Rachel. Do you feel a change? Marina?
Yeah, my thoughts are, so very briefly, I think unfortunately I would love to say that we do things timely, but we don't. It's almost like the data that we show today, that it's like responding to emergency. So I think that's an unfortunate thing. Like, I really wish we can say we're changing. We're obviously as a profession, like always looking, there are, you know, new regulations and things, and that takes time. We appreciate that has to be in a manner that, you know, it is a lengthy process. But what it is kind of like defeating is that we are often, particularly when it comes to inclusivity, just responding to emergency, where it's also too late.
So reactive rather than proactive and preventive. Interesting. Rachel, do you have any views as to how the awareness and desire has changed in this regard?
Sorry, Lara, I just find it, could you repeat that again? I just find it hard to hear some of the question.
How do you feel that the interest and the desire to consider inclusivity in design has changed over the last few years?
Thanks, Lara, I got that, thank you. So I guess from my perspective, that's an interesting question. Coming from the transport sector, but coming from Transport Infrastructure Ireland, we have many diverse professionals working in my organisation. So what I found is that bringing the story and the study and the findings from Travelling in a Woman's Shoes was completely new to a lot of colleagues, but not new to other colleagues. So that was interesting. Many of our professionals in the design stage, in the architects, the landscape architect, they were only too delighted to actually see the study coming out, because it gave them almost the mandate almost to take the findings, to take the conclusions, and actually to embed them into the work that they were doing. So, but the other cohort, then there was a little bit more effort that went into championing the work and explaining the whole reason why TII commissioned this work in the first instance. So it was an interesting dynamic. But just to say that my colleagues involved in the design and landscape architect work, they have taken the work that I have done and developed a gender checklist, a gender lens almost checklist to apply to our future transport projects. So in Ireland at the minute, we are investing a huge amount of funding into new public transport in Dublin, including a Metrolink and including expanding our light rail systems. We're also, our sister agency is also developing huge plans to reinvent our bus networks in Dublin. So the work was really timely. And I guess I kind of felt a little bit of invisible pressure in some ways to get this study and findings out before all of these kind of long-term projects were designed, because it's more, as we all know, it's crucial to get in at the start of these projects more than kind of the start of the design of these projects more than coming in at the end. So as I say, for my colleagues involved in these projects, they were only too delighted to take this and actually convert it or to develop this gender checklist, and that's being used now today in the design of our transport projects. So I think I've given you kind of a two answers to the one question, but the conversation certainly has taken off in the last 2 years in both Ireland and internationally, I think, as well. I can really see a change.
Thank you, Rachel. Hey, since your team is sort of one that gets involved in quite a few of those projects, how do you feel things have changed in the last few years?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we've noticed probably over the past 2-3 years is that the attitude and the appetite, I suppose, from our clients in relation to inclusive design has shifted, I think, for the positive or in a positive direction. And I think it's kind of that shift from thinking about inclusion as it's nice to have, it's something that the architects will cover it if they follow building regulations, to actually realising actually that's not good enough. And so I think there's definitely a shift, and it could be partly to do with the pandemic and the fact that that's highlighted a huge number of inequities within our communities, the social landscape as well, so Black Lives Matter and other things that have happened over the past few years. But I think there's definitely been a shift I think, in some of the clients that we've been working with over the past few years. And that I think leads quite nicely, if that's okay for me to ask a question actually, in terms of the panelists. In terms of the roles and your work, how have you challenged those kind of perceptions of inclusion as something nice to have, something that's, I suppose, softer than some of the kind of harder disciplines, I suppose? And do you have any examples of projects where this has been achieved well?
Shall we start with? Howard, do you wanna kick us off on this one? So May is asking how have you been able to challenge potentially from a designer out to clients? How have you been able to encourage and implement this inclusivity as not a soft add-on, but as one of the pillars of design?
Yeah, well, from doing all the research with the lighting and sharing that with our clients, it's always, when we look out, it's always a sea of nodding. And it, like, we know from people's lived experiences, it's like we know these things happen. But I think what often goes a little bit haywire is connecting that to practical, design outcomes or processes that we can implement on our projects. And I think sometimes we forget that design is an iterative process which can be explored in the physical world. It doesn't have to be explored on paper or through theory. And I feel like inclusivity sometimes becomes this insurmountable problem when we can, as designers, sort of, pitch little testing sites or pilot sites or with just keen clients and just test it out in the real world. And through testing and prototyping and, the nature of iterative design, we'll be able to sort of hone and perfect those processes over time. But until we start, getting them out there and getting the community to experience them and give us real live feedback, it's really quite difficult to think of as a really large problem. But I think if we break it up into little chunks, it's a good way to start.
Hey, would you agree with that in terms of have you been able to push the outcomes of your research in similar ways when it comes to practical projects?
It's really difficult. I think in the heritage field, we're already up against a lot of walls, particularly in development-driven context, because we're often already seen as something that the client doesn't really want to deal with. Or, like we are seen as an obstruction to development a lot of times, rather than something that can accent a project. And to be honest, the systems that we work within the planning system are not particularly progressive. And so the means by which we assess significance, for example, which then informs any mitigation strategy, it is still a bit archaic, and I don't think it is the most inclusive system. But that being said, there are certainly people in councils in Historic England who are raising this and saying we need to rethink the way that we define what is significant heritage and how that can inform the planning process. So it's happening, but very slowly.
Okay. Excellent. All right, do we have any questions in the audience at all before? I don't know, May, if you've been able to pick up some questions online. Otherwise, yeah, lots of questions virtually. Right, let's start with Fiona.
Just a quick question. Very interesting, the use of data to prove sort of what in some cases is the obvious that everybody knows. Do you think, which is great now that we have the ability to source that data and sort of work the data, do you think that as women we have to use data to prove more than, say, our male counterparts?
Who wants to take that? Sure. Marina, I was thinking that this relates a little bit about what you said about intersectionality and that ultimately, yeah, there's data and numbers, but there's also the personal experience of each person. Do you think that that's validated as much in terms as women, or do you think that, as Fiona is asking, women need to constantly sort of support whatever experience they have in the data?
I think that's a great question, because I'm like a big believer that, it's like we should make informed decisions based on the important information, based on the data. And I think it's kind of sometimes devastating that in today's world where we have access and we can use there are machines that know way better about us than we do know. So it's like it's a wealth of data. It's there, that we don't maybe use it to the extent that we should within the profession. Now there is obviously kind of a tricky bit about that as well, because obviously to make a policy, and I'm a policy planner, so kind of like always coming from there, but to enforce something kind of like a top down, like you need a policy, and to make a policy you need a robust evidence. It has to be like really solid. It cannot be just one of the issues that we were like afraid that if we don't get enough data within our research, it's going to be just experience of one person. Is it valid? Absolutely. But you need to have like wealth of data. Often we don't have resources to do that. Often it takes time, and obviously we had help of our group to then make sense of that data. So although it looks like a quick thing to do, it actually is way more into that. And then once you have that information, what do you do with that? It takes also time. Again, talking just from the perspective of planning authority, local planning authority. But I know, for example, there are some some authorities are also deploying mobile data, and I think we've seen that presented. It's a lot of opportunity, a lot of challenges, but the challenge shouldn't stop us from like really finding the way to do that. And I always say, like, apart from kind of collecting the data now, what I would absolutely like in the ideal world love to do is that every development, so we do something today based on the information we have it today. But then, it takes time for development to come forward. And then we need to evaluate actually how that works in practice. So you need to have sense check of that. So, and there are tools like we have post-application evaluation practice not used as much as we would like to, but yeah, definitely a huge opportunity.
Rachel, I was wondering, you talked to us about these various personality types or characters that you use in traveling in women's shoe as in fact almost being individual experiences rather than quantitative data. Did these resonate as much, you think, to make a change?
Oh, absolutely. One of the reasons ethnographic research was used as part of the study is because it is a really valuable way, an impactful way of trying to break down complex, contentious issues into kind of simplified stories. I don't mean simplified stories, but into real stories. And part of the ethnographic process is that you use the language coming from the women themselves, or you use photographs taken during the 2-hour visit with that woman as she's going around her daily travels. You take photographs on a phone, or may not be the highest quality photograph, but they're just much more impactful because people, I think it just resonates with people more. So we certainly found that by using that way, the stories from those women and outlining them in the report, that people really understood the issues in a much more solid way than if they were just reading stats and facts and figures. So it is a really important piece of our research, the ethnographic piece.
I'm conscious of time, but I know we have a lot of questions online, so let's just take the number one question, May, and then.
So there's one actually that follows on quite nicely from that, which is perhaps more targeted to Kaylee and Marina. You mentioned about obviously reaching out to people, the hard to reach, the voices that are perhaps not as often heard when it comes to consultation exercises. So the question really is, how did you approach that? How did you manage to sort of gain the trust of the communities that we were talking to, and how can we as designers and as an industry be more proactive in capturing the ambitions of those groups, those communities.
I think that is the question, really. And at least in my line of work, it really can vary greatly based on what sort of heritage work you're doing. And so a theme that came up a lot with, at least with my case study sites, was that they didn't, local stakeholders didn't feel that heritage professionals were invested in the local area. And that was, I think, to a bunch of different reasons, a huge one being high turnover, that they weren't seeing the same people over and over. It was a revolving door of people coming in and studying them and then leaving and taking off their data and off they go. So that's what makes it tricky, is that it requires quite a significant investment of time, I think, and understanding the nuances of the area that you're working in, and that's especially in a development driven context makes it difficult, because we very often do not have that amount of time. But I think practically the way that you do it is you really kind of have to almost take a data driven approach, where you really just make a list of the stakeholders and break them down into different groups and try to understand who are the people that you can talk to, who can be the entrees, who can introduce you to other groups, people that maybe aren't on the front lines, but a few connections deep. I think that tends to be the most effective way.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, particularly with being very difficult, and we experience that even when the topic is like really like important to people. I mean, we're quite lucky we have a regeneration team within LDC, so they have a very close connections with local communities. So we do have that access. And we also have, for example, Youth Voice panel, panel of like teenagers and, you know, young people, and we definitely use that. But are we still like doing a great job? No, is it still more? I mean, we learned through this that, you know, looking at the data, we're just like not really getting. So we try social media. So we thought like, oh, well, you know, these people might be on social media. Kind of worked not as much as I hoped. I don't know why. I was really thought like, oh, that's it, social media, everyone is there. It didn't really drive it. But I've actually recently heard, I think we had a similar discussion, maybe something as simple as vouchers. Like maybe, you know, you're paying for people's time. Like it's almost like they're doing your papers, so you're doing this research and you need them. It's like, well, no, it's their time. And I think someone said vouchers really working is something that really makes sense. Just compensate for people's time. Maybe that would be an incentive to get people to participate.
Thank you.
We're talking about innovation is the theme, so we probably need to innovate in terms of how to reach people, right? So I think it's time to close, and maybe you can summarize from your perspective everything that you've heard today, just so everybody knows. We had about 300 people join us online, so that was a great turnout, and happy International Women in Engineering Day, everyone. May, over to you for the close.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say huge thank you. So I think we've heard some amazing stuff from our panelists about who've given us lots of food for thought in terms of how we can collaborate more together, how we can integrate inclusive design and process as well into the way that we work and deliver our solutions and our projects. So I think there's lots of food for thought there. Again, really important to think about the wide spectrum of people that we're actually designing for, the end users, and what they actually need. And a really important part of that is obviously having those conversations, because as the panelists have all said, professional sort of input and expertise doesn't compensate for that lived experience. We absolutely need that feeding into the process. So yeah, as Lara said, this kind of brings us to the end of the session. So on behalf of both of us, just want to say a huge thank you to Marina, to Kaylee, to Rachel and Hoa, to the Connect Women team who have arranged a session as well. So my lovely co-chair, Lara, to Amar Zuz and to Katie Hynam as well, who I think is on the line. To our wonderful technical team, so we've got Shane Boniface and Carlisle as well in the room, and to all of you as well, to everyone who's in the room who's managed to get in despite the rail strikes, and to everyone who's online as well. Thank you so much for attending and for contributing to the conversation. Thank you, and happy International Women in Engineering Day.
Thank you.
Thank you all.